Today Matter.
Thank you, Thula, and thanks to you all. I just need to start by making two disclaimers. My paper does not really focus on diplomacy per se, but in my talks with Eddie in the corridors of the department, he felt that I could still present perhaps there are some insights, although on the fringes, that it could add to the conversation here, and I guess also I could get some feedback from you on how to develop it. And the second aspect is that this is still basically a think piece. I think if you printed and read at the end, it kind of tails off. And I put some notes for myself, to follow up later and as I develop the paper. But having said that, what this paper tries to do is to explore a brief encounter between a global humanitarian initiative and colonial welfarism in late colonial Zimbabwe, basically from the 60s to the early 1970s, when the soon-to-be rogue British colony of Rhodesia joined the Global Freedom from Hunger campaign. The main thrust of the paper is to illustrate how a progressive global idea was used for local conservative ends, mainly the entrenchment of a carefully managed brand of colonial modernity and the maintenance of secular power through what I call benign means, through developmental projects. These were two important imperatives in my view, given the breakup of the Central African Federation and the granting of independence to Zambia and Malawi in the beginning of 1964, a development that led to the increasing questioning of colonial rule in Rhodesia. Indeed, the exercise of colonial hegemony using soft welfarist power had been evolving in Rhodesia and indeed across the British colonial empire, as well as other empires for a long time since the end of World War I. For instance, just to give a highlight, the developments that led to or that culminated in the promulgation of the Colonial Development and Welfare Act in 1929, really started very early on during the interwar years. I think at the conjunctions of developments within Britain itself, the move towards a welfare state, the election of liberals in the early teens, Lloyd George and his colleagues, Asquith, etc., which I think in Britain led to, in the 40s, to the formation of, the National Health Service, etc. So these ideas of welfarism, of welfare state, also started seeping into the colonies, including Rhodesia. However, as colonial empires began to unravel after World War II, development discourses and welfarism in Africa entered a new phase as the forces of decolonization, multilateralism, and technocracy converged. Except the ideological epicenters of the Cold War, multilateral institutions mainly linked to the United Nations, but others independent of it, for example, the IMF and the World Bank, became the new drivers of big ideas and reform projects that swept across the continent in successive waves. From the disease eradication campaigns and community development projects of the 1950s, through the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 1990s, to recently the Millennium Development Goals of the new millennium, solving the world's challenges had become the major mandate of these multilateral institutions. Indeed, as many sub-Saharan African countries gained their independence in domino fashion since 1957, the first leaders who carried on their shoulders the many hopes of the masses for people-oriented reform began to look to these multilateral hills from whence they expected to get new forms of technical and other forms of support. Although Zimbabwe would only become independent nearly 2 decades later in 1980, in 1964, the initiation, in 1964 of the Freedom from Hunger campaign indicates that this wave of global humanitarian and developmental initiatives did not bypass the colony. A few other examples that I could mention, with the advent of biomedical birth control in the colony, which became an issue in the 1960s and 1970s, again coming from an American humanitarian organization called the Pathfinder Fund. So a lady called Edith Gates, she went around, several British colonies, including Kenya, Rhodesia, and others, beginning to spread this gospel of biomedical, birth control. But except, that initiative, there were also other ideas that were coming from these, big humanitarian organizations that had emerged and began to assume greater importance in global affairs post-World War II. Many of them linked to the UN, but some are very much independent of the UN. But my main focus here is the Food and Agriculture Organization's Freedom from Hunger campaign and how it was adopted in Rhodesia. So let me just say a few words about the initiative itself. So during the early 60s, international confidence in big replicable programs that could solve the world's most challenging problems was getting entrenched with the ascendance of these, global development behemoths in a variety of social, technical, and economic fields. Optimistically characterized as the decade of development, the 1960s saw the different multilateral agencies of the UN, including the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF, UNDP, etc., scrambling to put together their own programs for that so-called decade of development. Based in Rome, Italy, the Food and Agriculture Organization entered the decade of development brandishing its own pioneering but very ambitious program called the Freedom from Hunger campaign. Meant to be a worldwide awareness campaign, this project was launched by the organization's then Director General, B.R. Sen. He was a native Indian who had worked to try and deal with the Bengali famine of the early 1940s, and he had become a diplomat, Indian diplomat, before he was appointed as the DG of FAO in 1956, a position that he held until 1967. So following his appointment at FAO, Sen did many things to elevate the profile of the organization, including launching a memorial lecture series in 1959 in honor of Frank McDougall, one of the founding fathers of the agency. Frank McDougall was an Australian, diplomat, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, at one point he held a position as an Australian, prime minister. So the inaugural lecture was given by a very prominent British historian, Arnold Toynbee, in 1959. And Toynbee looked at the relationship between hunger and population. And I think it was becoming an issue at that time. The World Bank also was getting concerned about population explosion, etc. So it was but following the lecture by Arnold Toynbee was another one by the chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time, J.D. Rockefeller III, who addressed the issues of food and well-being. However, the Food and Agriculture Organization's flagship program under SEN was coming up with the Freedom from Hunger campaign, which set the agency on course to convene the first World Food Congress in Washington, D.C. in 1963, and later to adopt the Universal Declaration on the Eradication of Hunger and Malnutrition. Although some accounts emphasize the role played by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of FDR, and Frank McDougall in lobbying the world to adopt the Freedom from Hunger campaign since 1955, the campaign is generally regarded as B.R. Sen's brainchild. Explaining how he came up with the idea of a worldwide campaign, Sen said the following, quote and unquote, "For many years I've lived with this problem, and when I became DG of FAO in 1956, I became more and more conscious of the fact that all we had done so far through international and bilateral aid was insufficient. I felt that the problem could only be tackled effectively if people everywhere in the world became fully conscious of its nature and magnitude. It was with these ideas in mind that I proposed the Freedom from Hunger campaign so that all men and women and children in all countries could join in the struggle to eliminate hunger." And according to Matthew James Bunch, Sen used the Freedom from Hunger campaign to modernize the work of the international development and to help transform FAO from a technical organization into a development agency. The Freedom from Hunger campaign pioneered the kinds of relationships among governments, governmental organizations, NGOs, and other organizations and agencies taken for granted today. The campaign had two main objectives. Number one, to create a worldwide awareness of the problems of hunger and malnutrition. But number two, to promote a climate of opinion in which solutions to these problems can be organized both on a national and on an international basis. Now, moving to how Rhodesia became part of the campaign. So, although colonial officials in Rhodesia denied their African subjects the greater benefits, particularly the greater political benefits of modernity, such as consent to be ruled, democracy, and equality, they embraced and showed great enthusiasm in wanting to share with Africans those aspects of modernity that would enhance, or that could enhance, their legitimacy. As if in answer to Cicero's antiquated order to ancient colonizers to exercise what he called humanitas in their rule, they actively sought, where possible, to exercise soft power through welfare programs. This could make up for exclusions in other areas. In this area, colonial officials were keen to cultivate African agency, and they worked through a variety of social institutions such as self-help programs, associations, societies to achieve these goals. And so Rhodesia's participation in the Freedom from Hunger campaign should be understood against this background. Rhodesia applied to join the global campaign in January 1964, and FAO promptly admitted them. Thereafter, the Rhodesian government, through the Ministry of Agriculture, started setting up a national committee which became known as the Rhodesia Freedom from Hunger campaign, and its first chairman was a popular farmer and writer called L.T. Tracy. And this committee comprised experts and individuals representing different organizations, health, education, social welfare, internal affairs, churches, women's organizations, voluntary associations, and many others, including teachers and broadcasters, etc., etc. There were African representatives on the committee, a social worker, a school teacher with interest in broadcasting, and a farmer. All in all, the committee had 14 members. At that time, when Rhodesia joined the global campaign, the colony was not facing an urgent food shortage per se, and therefore, on the advice of the then Minister of Agriculture, Lord Graham, the committee decided to focus on what they called hidden hunger, which is malnutrition, and made it their aim to produce sufficient food with the correct values. So these are, their words. Both undernutrition, especially among, children, and the groundswell of debates about the African population explosion framed their thinking and focus. However, the committee avoided the very divisive, population debates of the time because, there were all sorts of, complications and problems associated with those debates. But I'll, come back and refer to some of them later on. So the committee met for the first time on February 13, 1964, and at that time they were addressed by the chairman of the UK Freedom from Hunger Committee, Right Honourable Il Delaware. And in April the same year, the committee also met the Southern African Field Director of Oxfam, the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief. So they basically had, started their fundraising efforts or their resource mobilization efforts. And these meetings with the two key UK agencies indicated very early on that the strategy of the campaign in Rhodesia was to work with the metropole, the mother country, and try by all means to get resources from them. And they did succeed, because at that first meeting, the chairman of the UK committee indicated that they had already raised £6 million for the for the Rhodesian Freedom from Hunger campaign. And even during UDI, those pledged funds kept coming in. And, in some of the annual reports, the Rhodesia Freedom from Hunger campaign did mention that, regardless of UDI, we still are receiving, the pledged aid from the UK. So the initial strategy was, of course, resource mobilization, but what the committee then did was to replicate itself into regional committees and then district committees, right? And through those committees, they did project assessments. So they would call, for project proposals for different, local developmental projects, initiatives that were meant to address issues of malnutrition and hunger in the different communities across the colony. And they would assess the different projects and then recommend, a few for funding. For instance, in 1964, they issued a call for project proposals. And at the end of the assessment process, the first project that was selected was one that was aimed at accommodating African farmers who were visiting the Henderson Research Station. This was an agricultural station, and these farmers were meant to participate in field days, in agricultural demonstration, etc., etc. The second project was meant to provide transport services to each of the provinces, and what they wanted to do was to embark on educational campaigns or awareness campaigns about about nutrition, about growing the right crops with the correct food values, about rapid keeping, about many projects, vegetable gardens, etc., etc. So that was at least at the beginning the second project that was sponsored. The third project was a plan to set up mobile training units to supplement the different regional training programs that were already in existence. However, it became very clear early on in the work of the committee that its goals would not be accomplished solely by recommending projects for overseas or for local financial support. Instead, it was also imperative to launch a massive propaganda campaign that would help to bring home to the underprivileged the essential need to improve their living standards and to create an awareness amongst those unfortunate of the facts. To create awareness amongst those more fortunate of the fact of malnutrition and of their duty to help remove it. The campaign launched a newsletter to aid, these efforts. The newsletter was in circulation right from the beginning in 1965 until early in 1971. The campaign also made strategic use of film shows to communicate their message. The international shell film Food or Famine was screened in many locations around the colony. And through its regional committees, the campaign embarked on a number of other projects. For instance, they organized the master farmer programs where they trained, different African farmers and certified them. And just to give sort of an overview of the statistics, during the 1963 to 64 season, they started with 8, master farmer groups, but by the end of 1966 to 67, they had 65 of these groups. Although the improvement of African agriculture had been a going concern in the colony for a long time, the campaign raised the profile of a deeper association between agriculture and health. And this was the so-called marriage of health and agriculture. An idea, how many minutes? Okay. An idea that had been developing globally from the 1930s, partly because of debates in the League of Nations Health Organization, but partly because of individuals like Frank McDougall that I spoke about earlier, as well as Lord Bruce, actually Stanley Bruce, later known as Lord Bruce, the High Commissioner and former Prime Minister of Australia, is the one who proposed this notion of marriage of health and agriculture. And this became an influential phrase as experts and officials around the world framed their local policies. The Rhodesian campaign used it as well. Although it started as a nice-to-say proposition, droughts and famine forced the campaign to give serious attention to the marriage, and this could be one of their lasting legacies. The campaign's focus on heat and hunger transformed into a preoccupation with protein deficiency and a lack of other food values among the Africans. As the chairman of the campaign, Tracy, said in 1966, quote unquote, "In a country such as this, where so many people are quite literally attached to the soil, we have a great opportunity of instilling the knowledge that treated the right way and growing sufficient of the right crops, the soil can yield abundant health for the family." Tracy emphasized the prospects and legacy of introducing protein foods such as skimmed milk powder and other protein additives. As he said, quote unquote, "To many of these parents, the idea of buying powdered milk and protein additive soup powder to feed their children is an almost revolutionary change and may well continue in the future." Tracy envisaged that the marriage could work along the lines of the Valley Trust project here in South Africa, whereby when a mother brought a child to the clinic, first the child would be seen by the health officials, and then before they go, they were taken to an agriculturalist who would teach them about vegetable gardens, about growing the right crops, etc., etc., etc. So this was the idea. But another innovation of the campaign was the introduction of the World Baby Clinics. And I think this became the legacy. I grew up in the 80s, myself, early 80s, the 90s, and we were taken to these, baby clinics. I didn't know at that time, where they came from, but they began or started in Rhodesia by the Freedom from Hunger campaign. They also started the community nursing program. So as opposed to clinical nurses, the community nursing program meant that these nurses would go to communities when they hear that there's been a childbirth in a particular home. They would visit that homestead, offer all kinds of teachings about taking care of the baby, immunizations, etc., etc. So that was the community nursing program, again pioneered in Rhodesia by the Freedom from Hunger campaign. In addition, there was the school feeding scheme, which again continued into the 1980s. I remember in the mid-80s when I was starting, grade 1, we were taken to a mission school, primary school, Salvation Army run primary school, where we're given, cups of milk. I wasn't aware at that time, where all that was coming from. But, when I got into the archives to do some research, that's when I got to know about this program. In times of emergency, the campaign also launched initiatives such as the one that they did in 1965 to 66, the Children of Drought Fund, to try and resolve the drought that was ravaging Matabeleland at the time. So, just a few pictures illustrating some of the programs that the campaign embarked on. I'm not sure whether it's clear on the screen from where you're seated, but this is a school feeding scheme in 1971. This is an issue out of food rations. I think this is maheu. We call it maheu in local parlance. In 1967, Malcolm Carruthers on the right, with the Oxfam team, visiting Matabeleland after that drought that I spoke about. And in this picture, the chairman of the campaign, L.T. Tracy, was handing over some Land Rovers to be used in the campaign across the country, in the education campaign, etc., etc. And this is December 1970, a headmaster of Makalambila School. He was discussing, the issue of height and weight in relation to, age of the children. And I'm hoping that this would be the last one. But here they were talking about this. This was in a school setting. They were talking to this young boy who, was planting some mangoes at school, at Chirika School, and these are women who participated in one of the training programs of the campaign. Now, just to conclude, the campaign was opposed very strongly by the two liberation movements, ZAPU and ZANU. And one of their criticisms was that, why is it that, the focus was on children and not on, on adults? So in the context of debates about population, in the context of the intransigency of the UDI at that time, the thinking was that this was all part of a campaign to try and poison African children and limit African populations. And so the Children of Drought Fund, which I spoke about in Matabeleland, was meant to reach about 45,000 children, but in the end they only reached about 8,000 children. And in a very big district with about 30 schools, they only managed to reach one school, because Nkomo's ZAPU threatened to destroy schools, to disrupt the program on the basis of the fact that, why is it, in their language they said, why is it focusing on the cows and not the cows and the bulls? Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. And the connections you make between what Dr. Sen founded and how it plays out in Zimbabwe. But it also raised a few questions about another Sen, who is Amartya Sen. And you were talking about how the Global Freedom from Hunger campaign sought to transform FAO from a technical organization into a development organization, if I got you correctly.
Yes.
There. And I was wondering how, around the same time, I think that's when Sen published his Development as Freedom, and you have this program being instituted in a UDI Rhodesia. And the way it sounds, where they're trying to train master farmers on certain ways of, doing agriculture, sounds very much like the Native Land Husbandry Act, reinstituted. And if you connect it to the population debates, which you yourself have written about, Josiah Brownell and others, you kind of see that connection. So I was wondering whether you would connect the kind of development as freedom versus the adoption of, the Global Freedom from Hunger campaign being taken in Rhodesia and used in a very different way from the ways in which it was initially intended.
I'm not sure whether I'll be able to expertly comment on Amartya Sen and make those connections. But if I can just thumbs up in response, I would say that the way in which these big organizations were casting their programs at this time was to put them in these developmental discourse and language and benign means that you develop, you lead to freedom, or the other way around, or the connections between development and freedom. But I think what I get in the Rhodesian case, at least what was being attempted was the opposite. In that a very much, I think, developmental idea, and I think, of course, there might have been weaknesses in the idea itself, its conception, etc., but it was very much, progressive and developmental idea. But the fact that it could be used for very conservative purposes, I think this is what is intriguing, to me. This is what is interesting to me, and I just wanted to look at, these complications and ambiguities, relating to how such a progressive idea could be used, for very conservative ends. By the way, even in the international context, I guess there are experts here on the Cold War and ideologies, etc., etc. I think such ideas kind of brought the two poles together in some very difficult conversations, of course, but there seem to be some commonalities of interests, some very much untidy. So I think this is kind of a rambling answer to your question. Unfortunately, I'm not very much clued up on the Amartya Sen argument and idea.